Most gardeners are, losing the majority of their potato yield before harvest even begins, not because of pests, not because of weather, but because of how they plant them. They bury potatoes shallow, crowd them incorrectly, and then, wonder why they end up with small, uneven tubers or soil that turns hard and unproductive halfway through the season. Here's the real issue. Potatoes don't fail because they lack fertilizer. They fail because the root zone never expands properly. When soil is compacted or poorly layered, tubers form small, uneven, and stressed. You get foliage above ground, but very little production below it. That's why traditional gardening advice often leads to disappointing yields in small spaces. Now, before we get into the Amish method that completely changes this, there's something I've started using that improved the consistency of my soil inputs. I use a 4-litre electric composter for kitchen to process food scraps into stable, usable material instead of relying on inconsistent compost piles that vary from batch to batch. That consistency matters more than people think when you're building high-yield soil systems. I'll leave the exact one I use in the description if you want to check it out. Now let's get into what actually produces massive potato yields in small spaces. The Amish method isn't about magic soil or secret seeds. It's about stacking biology, depth and timing in a way that maximizes tuber production per square foot. And most people misunderstand it completely. They think potatoes need space to spread horizontally. That's not true. Potatoes are vertical growers when conditions are right. The plant keeps producing tubers along buried stems as long as you keep giving it depth and loose, living soil. That's the entire principle behind this method. Let's break it down the way it's actually used in real gardens. You start with a deep, well-aerated base layer. In a 4 square foot space, you prepare soil that is at least 30 to 40 centimeters deep. But depth alone isn't enough. The soil needs structure, loose, breathable, and biologically active. I use a mix of mature compost, loose garden soil, and a bit of coarse organic matter to prevent compaction. It's roughly a balanced blend where compost makes up about 1/3 of the mix. The goal is not just nutrients, it's oxygen flow. Now here's where the Amish method begins to differ from standard planting. Instead of planting all seed potatoes at once, you start with a shallow layer at the base, about 10 centimeters deep. You place your seed potatoes spaced evenly, around 15 to 20 centimeters apart in that 4 square foot space. Then you cover them lightly with soil and wait. This is where most gardeners make a mistake. They rush to mound everything immediately. That actually stresses the plant early and reduces tuber initiation. You wait until the plant reaches about 15 to 20 centimeters above the soil surface before adding more soil. Then you cover again, leaving only the top leaves exposed. You repeat this process gradually, building upward layers every time the plant grows. What you're doing is creating a vertical tuber production zone along the buried stem. Each buried section of stem can produce new potatoes, so instead of one shallow layer of tubers, you get multiple stacked layers of production. Now let me explain why this works biologically. Potatoes form tubers along underground stems called stolons. These stolons develop best in loose, oxygen-rich soil. When you keep adding fresh soil around the stem, you continuously trigger new stolon formation. That means more tubers per plant. In a confined 4 square foot space, this stacking effect multiplies yield dramatically compared to standard planting. Now let's talk about the mistake most people make that kills this system. They use compacted or poorly aerated soil. If the soil is dense, stolons can't expand properly. Instead of forming large tubers, you get small, deformed ones. That's why soil structure is more important than fertilizer in this method. And this connects back to something I've noticed in every high-performing garden system I've tested. Soil life matters more than nutrient concentration. If your soil isn't biologically active, even perfect spacing won't give you high yields. Now let's bring in real numbers, because this is where people start to see the difference. In a traditional garden bed, you might get 10 to 15 pounds of potatoes from 4 square feet under average conditions. With proper layering and soil management using this method, yields can reach 60, sometimes even approaching 100 pounds in ideal conditions with strong varieties and good maintenance. Not because the plant is different, but because the growing environment is optimized vertically instead of horizontally. Now let's talk about maintenance during growth. Watering is critical. Potatoes need consistent moisture but not saturation. The soil should stay evenly damp, especially during tuber formation. If it dries out, tubers stop expanding properly. If it becomes waterlogged, rot can develop. The balance is simple: steady moisture without compaction. Mulching also plays a major role here. A light organic mulch layer helps stabilize temperature and reduces evaporation between soil additions. Now here's something most gardeners don't realize. Fertilizer is not the driver of yield in this system. You don't need heavy feeding. In fact, too much nitrogen will push excessive leafy growth at the expense of tubers. What you want is balanced soil biology and moderate nutrient release. That's where consistent organic matter input matters more than synthetic feeding. And this is why having a reliable way to process kitchen scraps becomes useful in the long term. When your compost input is stable, your soil structure improves season after season, instead of fluctuating. Now let's talk about timing, because harvesting this method is slightly different. You don't dig everything at once early. Instead, you wait until the plant fully matures and begins to yellow. That's when tubers have reached maximum size. Then you carefully remove the soil layer by layer, revealing each production zone. What you'll often find is multiple layers of potatoes stacked vertically where each soil addition was made. That's the stacked yield effect that makes this method so powerful in small spaces. Now let's address something important. This is not a lazy method. It requires attention during growth stages. If you ignore layering timing or let the plant get stressed, you lose yield potential. But when done correctly, it outperforms standard potato planting by a large margin in small gardens. Now here's how this translates into different systems. In raised beds, this method works exceptionally well because you already have depth control. You just manage layering carefully and maintain loose soil. In containers, you can replicate it almost exactly using large grow bags or deep buckets. The key is adding soil incrementally as the plant grows upward. In-ground gardens work too, but soil compaction becomes more important to manage. Now let's correct a common misconception. People think potatoes are low-maintenance crops. They're not if you want high yields. They're simple to grow, but not optimized by default. The Amish method works because it turns a simple crop into a managed vertical production system. And once you understand that principle, you start applying it to other crops as well. Any plant that can produce along buried stems responds to similar layering techniques. Now, here's the bigger takeaway. High yields don't come from adding more inputs. They come from designing better growing environments. Depth, soil structure, biological activity, and timing matter more than fertilizer alone. And when those factors align, even a small 4 square foot space can outperform much larger traditional beds. So if your potato harvests have been inconsistent, small, or disappointing, the problem isn't the seed, it's the system. Fix the system, and the yield takes care of itself. Subscribe to FamLogic if you want more real-world gardening methods like this, tested in actual soil, not theory. And share this with someone who still thinks potatoes only grow in wide open spaces, because once you understand vertical soil layering, your entire approach to gardening changes from the ground up.